Hi everyone, welcome back to our first lecture in our course Introductory Phonology. I've made myself another cup of coffee so that we are well set to now talk about how we're going to formalize the description of these allophones of English that we've just discovered using some phonological rules. So to quickly review, let's just talk about the nasals here. To review, we had discovered that this alveolar nasal and a dental nasal, shown in the data set in 2, stood in complementary distribution to one another. And because the alveolar nasal had a wider range of occurrence than the dental nasal, we posited that alveolar nasal as the underlying phoneme with these two allophones of an alveolar nasal and a dental nasal. So this means in terms of creating a rule system to describe this fact about English, we don't need any rules to derive the allophone of the alveolar nasal from the underlying phoneme because simply nothing changes, but we will need a rule, a phonological process, in order to derive that dental nasal. So in other words, we always want to try to do better than just saying which sounds belong to the same phoneme and which environments they occur in. We're going to formalize rules that specify where and under what conditions specific allophones occur. So stated in words, we can say that the underlying phoneme of an alveolar nasal becomes dental in the environment following an interdental fricative th. When we put this using the usual rule notation, the following results here. So we see between slashes, the underlying phoneme, between square brackets for the phonetic representation, we see the sound that occurs in the surface representation. And over here, we see the condition. If we use the phonological feature system that we'll learn about a few lectures hence, we can say that the phonological feature of the underlying alveolar nasal, which is changed, is that this nasal becomes plus distributed. But again, we'll talk about this a few weeks hence. So to kind of describe how this rule formalism works and how such rules are to be understood, I want to make clear that these rules have 2 parts. So one talks about a rule as having a structural description and a structural change. So the structural change tells us what happens in the course of the rule, and that is found to the left of the slash. So let's look at our rule, and we use this slash symbol. I'll rewrite the rule over here in my text document. So to the left of the slash, we find this. This is our structural change. It's saying that an underlying alveolar nasal becomes dental. The structural change is always going to identify some target sound, either a single sound or a set of sounds if we have a natural class of sounds. And then it says that that sound or group of sounds becomes some other sound or set of sounds. So the arrow pointing to the right, I think intuitively, should transmit that idea. The slash that we find separating the structural description and the structural change can be read as the words "in the environment of." And on the right side of the rule, in the structural description, we find the sequence of an underscore, and that underscore refers to the target sound to the left of the arrow. So in the structural description of our rule, the underscore, in a sense, stands for this underlying alveolar nasal. And here, the local context is crucial. So in the structural description of our rule, the structural description is when the underlying alveolar nasal stands in front of an interdental fricative. So now we can use a phonological derivation, which is a device that we will use throughout this course, to illustrate how our rule works. So a derivation we can define as a tool that is employed to check or demonstrate that the analysis that you've developed actually works the way that you expect it to. And it's usually a good idea as well to give the phonological rules that you develop a name in order to explain what they do. So for instance, if you were writing a research paper, a name for a rule would help to make it clear to your readers what that rule is supposed to do. And in this case, I'll give this rule the name n-dentalization. So let's try deriving the two English forms onion and month. So those were two forms that we saw in our data in example set 2. Here's the word onion, and here's the word month. And so based on our phonemic analysis, you'll see there that in the underlying phonemes of them there of course is no dental nasal. Anytime that we saw in a surface form a dental nasal, as we did in month here, that dental nasal has been replaced with an alveolar nasal because our analysis of the phonology of English says native speakers of English don't recognize a contrast between alveolar nasals and dental nasals. They just have one category, one phoneme, which is best represented underlyingly as the alveolar nasal, and we use the rule that we've just developed here in order to derive all instances of a dental nasal. So we begin in a derivation at the top by showing the underlying representation. Then following the underlying representation, we find a set of rules, and finally the surface representations of those words. And the surface representations ought to correspond to the data that we've actually observed. In our case, in order to derive the form month, we only need a single rule, but if we had one other rule, so for instance, we'll probably talk about this course, the English rule of coronal tapping. It's not really relevant for any of these forms. And when a rule doesn't apply, we just show a dash like this to show the rule hasn't applied. When a rule does apply, as n-dentalization does in the case of the word month, then we rewrite the word with the relevant sounds having been changed. So in this case, in a sense, we can say that our rule of n-dentalization, which was formalized here, the rule works as follows. It looks at the underlying representation of the word. It checks to see if there are any instances of a coronal nasal standing before an interdental fricative. And if so, if it finds a coronal nasal standing before an interdental fricative, then the rule applies, and that underlying alveolar nasal is changed into a dental nasal. And let's also, before we move on to another extended exercise, let's take note that this analysis requires just a single rule to handle a case of two allophones. So let's remember here we have at the phonemic level for English, we have the single phoneme, right? And at the allophonic level, we have an allophone which is identical to the underlying phoneme. And we have a sound which is different from the underlying phoneme. Having difficulty copying this. There we go. And of course, we only need a single rule because we don't need a rule that tells us where the alveolar allophone is going to be realized. Simply, since the alveolar sound is already there in the underlying representation, if no rules alter it, then it will simply surface as an alveolar nasal. So it would be redundant and unnecessary to write any rules that tell us where the alveolar nasal occurs. We only need a single rule in order to specify where the dental nasal occurs. Okay, so now that we've seen all of the crucial parts of conducting a basic phonemic analysis, namely using minimal pairs to try to decide if there are contrastive phonemes, and using complementary distributions to see if two sounds could belong to the same phoneme and what the environments for the different allophones would be. Um, and then finally, writing a rule to derive the allophone, which we have not chosen as the underlying representation for that phoneme, we can move on to conducting a more extended analysis. So I'll be back in one moment. We'll start talking about the O'odham language.